Hello everyone, it's Carol here at Oak House Journals, and I'm going to be doing week 24 and week 25 of the Stitched Circle Show Challenge being hosted by Lisbeth Degn. The first dogma rule for week 24 is to take a piece of fabric in white or off-white colour and to colour it using watercolour paints, tea or coffee. So this is my piece of chosen fabric. It's a piece of vintage bed linen, and instead of using tea or coffee, I'm going to use watercolour paints. So here I've lifted out my watercolour paints, and I'm going to aim to try and get a nice pale blue colour to my fabric. And to help me do that, I'm going to lightly spray my fabric just with a spray bottle filled with some lukewarm water so that I don't get my fabric too saturated with colour. So here I've mixed up my blue paint, watercolour paint, and I just dab it onto the fabric. You can see I've started to do so in this picture. I'm not at all bothered that my fabric is well and truly scrunched there, because the second part of the first dogma rule was to crumple the fabric into a tight ball once it was painted and set it aside to air dry. So here I've just mopped up some paint that was left on my watercolour palette, and here I've scrunched it up as tight as I could possibly get it and popped it on a white saucer, and I actually put that outside in the sunshine to air dry. Being the UK, it was outside for a good couple of hours, but this is what it looked like when I brought it in and opened it out. So the second dogma rule was that once our piece of fabric was dry, we were to iron it, but not to iron out all the little creases, and then trace 3 overlapping circles onto the fabric in different sizes. So this is what my fabric looks like now that it's ironed. I only gave it a really light swipe over, really, with my iron. There were 1 or 2 brown patches that mysteriously appeared on my fabric, and that's what I'm showing here. It wasn't bothering me, so I didn't go in and dye another piece of fabric. The piece of fabric I chose was much too big for the size of my journal, so here you can see that I've ripped my piece of fabric in half, and I've got a piece there on the left hand side on my journal page so that you can see how it's going to fit. Here I've drawn out 3 circles onto my fabric with a Friction marker pen, but I've also done an inner circle to each one to give me a bit of a guide when I'm doing my stitching. And talking about stitching, the stitch we're to use this week, and the third dogma rule, is a straight stitch, which we're to sew vertically over the outlines of the three traced circles. And then the fourth dogma rule is our thread colour, and we are to use a different colour for each circle but in the same colour tone as the fabric colour. So here I'm showing you the 3 spools of thread, all Perlé 12 weight cotton, and obviously because my fabric colour is blue, these are 3 shades of blue, but actually you can see that 2 of the spools are variegated. So here you can see my finished piece for week 24, taking on board all of those dogma rules. I've got my 3 trace circles there using a different one of those colour thread spools for each circle, and only doing straight stitches sewn vertically over the outlines of those 3 traced circles. There are a few close-up photos for you to have a look at before I move on to week 25 and the dogma rules for that week, but what I want to point out is I hope you can see that I've gone narrower with my stitching where the circles overlap, and towards the outside of the fabric I've made my stitches larger and more open. So here you are seeing those close-up photos. and also the brown marks on the piece of fabric as well. Definitely an interesting one to stitch this week, and I'll leave you just with a couple more photos before I move on to week 25. Okay, so here we are at week 25, and the first Dogma rule for this week was to take a piece of watercolour paper or card and to trace a circle on it. So here you're seeing my usual poppy dimensional paste and a Frickson marker pen to trace round to create that circle. So here it is, here's my circle, albeit a bit wobbly, and I've just used a pair of scissors and cut round that to complete the first Dogma rule. The second Dogma rule was to paint random small circles inside the larger cut circle. As you can see, I've got my cut circle there and my watercolour paints, and I've just activated my paints and created a nice light blue colour to create just a gentle wash of colour, and just going in with my paintbrush and creating a few small random circles. I have no idea how many I'm doing at this stage. I'm just going in, creating little circles and enjoying myself. And I'm just going to speed up the camera a little bit so that the whole process is moved along a bit for you. And this is what my cut circle looks like now that all my little dots have been done, and I just set that off to one side to air dry for about 10 minutes, really, not very long at all. The next Dogma rule, the fourth one I believe, was the stitches we are to use, and this week it was straight stitch again, but we had to ensure that none of our stitches crossed, but we had to use those straight stitches to connect each of those little painted circles together. The final Dogma rule was the thread colour, and we were given a free choice as to what thread colour we used. I decided to use one of those 3 spools of thread that I used last week, because these 2 spreads are going to sit side by side in my journal, so I wanted a little bit of a flow or continuity between the 2 spreads, week 24 and this week's. As I've said, the straight stitches are to connect all the little painted circles together, but they're not to cross. So here I've started doing some stitching. I've used my needle to punch holes in the front face of my card, and I've begun connecting my circles together. This next photo shows that I've moved on a little bit and done a bit more stitching. And again, a little bit further on with this one. And then this is what my final piece looks like. And I'm sure you spotted straight away that I haven't followed the Dogma rules exactly this week. I have taken a little bit of artistic license with the rules, and I've stitched to the outside edge of my cut circle. I just thought that this helped to finish off the stitching a bit better. Also, because my chosen card for the main circle is white and my journal pages are white, I decided that it was going to look better if I backed this piece before I put it in my journal or adhered it to my journal pages. So I used the leftover piece of painted fabric from week 24 and gave that another press, and then mounted my circle onto the fabric before I stuck it into my journal. So here you're seeing the absolutely finished and completed piece now that it's all stitched and backed with my fabric. And as I say, that will now be glued into my journal. So there we go, everybody. Those are my pieces for week 24 and 25 of the Stitched Circle Show Challenge being hosted by Lisbeth Degn. There are no bonus pieces for me to include in the video this week. Apologies about that, but I only work the bonus pieces on the home rusted fabric when there is a particular design or technique that I want to go off piste with, shall we say. But thank you as always for watching. Really do appreciate your company, and I look forward to seeing you next week, and look forward very much to seeing what Lisbeth is going to come up with for week 26. Until then, everybody, take care. Bye bye now.